All right, I feel like I've talked enough about grades. So let's talk about weekly question. Weekly question. All right, I'm looking. It's the last day of Zoom class for us, and I still don't know how to use Zoom. Very, very sad. Okay. All right, so weekly question, weekly question. Hey, on the Confederate weekly question, if I had issues with it, it's because you guys really like the second part of the question, advantages did the Confederacy have? But I mean, that part, everybody did pretty well. Basic premise of the Confederate government, I mentioned you should probably talk about stuff that was protected, confiscation, who the leaders were, that sort of thing, and not everybody did. And then why did its leaders think victory would be theirs? Why did they think they would win? Which is a little different than what were the advantages. So, because some of you just listed advantages. And that, I mean, it's most of the question. It's just not the whole thing. Uh-oh. I'm getting something that says my internet connection is unstable. So if I end up checking out on you, I'll try to check back in. Okay. Was Reconstruction a success or failure? We've been over this 8 million times, haven't we? So, sorry for the yawn. Excuse me. Tell me what Reconstruction was. It's that period of bringing the North and South back together, rebuilding, that kind of thing, after the Civil War. And then tell me some land policy, key legislation, give me some details. And, still, even last week of the class or next to last week of the class, there's some people that just say really super generic things without names, dates, places, that sort of thing. You got to mention specific stuff. So that way I know that you learned something or at least look something up while you're writing the question, however it is you want to go about it. And this doesn't need to be several pages long, one page is fine. But put in some specific stuff. Some specific stuff you want to put in. I would name the presidents, perhaps Johnson and Grant. And I would try to write about stuff in as much chronological order as you can, or you can go through with this order of the question and talk about land policy. When you talk about land policy, you probably want to talk about Sherman's Special Order, I think it's 15, where some land was redistributed, that was part of the initial purpose of the Freedmen's Bureau, was to help distribute land. But then when Johnson became president, he ordered that all the land be returned to the plantation owners, and there wasn't any land redistribution. You could also talk about how then most former slaves and honestly poor white people in the South became sharecroppers, so landless farmers. So it really kind of kept the same people, plantation owner type folks, in power, just in a new situation. Key legislation, you definitely want to talk about the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. I know I've said that every time we've talked about this question. You might also want to talk about the military reconstruction bill that set up the 5 military districts, and that those states within those districts would not be allowed to reconstruct or vote for their own government until they agreed to ratify the 14th and 15th Amendment, which no Southern state ever did. Oops. You could also talk about local legislation that might have included restrictions on voting, black codes, that sort of thing, labor contracts, if you would like. And again, I recognize that if you talk about every single thing, it's going to be 5 pages long. You don't need to talk about everything, but you do have to have some specifics in there. And, I would say minimum amendments on this, okay. Southern politics, I would talk about how most Southerners, white Southerners, voted for Democrats, and how Black Southerners, when they were voting, voted for Republicans. And the goal of white Southerners really was to keep Black Southerners from voting. And the goal of whites in the North was to keep Black Southerners voting because they tended to vote for people that were more favorable to the North. Racial and political violence, that kind of screams out KKK, as it should. So talk about formation of the KKK, and then probably in reaction to that, the force acts, which were successful when used. Certainly it led to pretty broad suppression of the KKK in 72, 73, right around there. And you really didn't see the KKK in a large way again until about 19 something, early 19, mid 1900s, mid 19 teens, sorry, not 1900s. Yeah, you'll see them again during the Civil Rights Movement. That is not to say that there weren't people in the South who weren't harassing African Americans. I'm just saying that as a group, the KKK had to go underground, and certainly were not going to be visible during elections, that kind of thing. All right, Northern fatigue with Reconstruction as time went along. The people who had really been supportive of Reconstruction, who truly thought blacks and whites should be treated equally, they weren't involved in politics anymore. Either they were deceased or they were just really old and they weren't involved in politics anymore. So the new thing really was business and railroads and making money, that sort of thing. So that's kind of where you end up. And then people in the North say, you know what, we'll just let the South take care of it. You should wrap this question up with the Compromise of 1877. So I would say at the end, it's a must that you talk about how Reconstruction ends. So that is all my advice on the weekly question. It's pretty much the same advice I've given you the last 2 times I gave you advice on the weekly question. So I'm not changing my mind. There you go. All right, do you have any questions about the weekly question? Anything you want to ask? Now is a good time. Okay, I'm going to go with that as a no. You know, every time I see that little cartoon on Facebook or in teacher groups I'm a part of that says conducting a Zoom meeting for high school is like a seance, I go like, yeah, it's true. It's true. All right, let's look at the review. Now, this review thing, you know, it's in your, what is that thing? Course documents section. It's in the course documents section. It says something like Unit 4 timed question review or quiz review, something like that. Oh, sorry for the giant yawn. Also, sorry for leaving my phone on so it beeped. That's all about soccer. Everybody's going to tournaments this weekend and they all want paperwork done. It's like, I'm busy. All right, so you're busy as well. Thinking about the quiz. Have you taken the quiz? I know a couple of you have. Also, hey, somebody emailed me and said that the, what is that? The extra question, whatever, wasn't available up until midnight or something the day it was due, 11:59, whatever. It looked to me, I went back and looked at it, looked to me like it was displayed until 6 a.m. the next morning. So I think it was there. So if you didn't turn it in, I think it was you, not me, but I don't know. I'm not saying that definitively, but it looked like, from what I could tell, that I programmed it till 6 a.m. the following morning because, you know, all right, I didn't want you booted out of it if you were still writing at 12:02. Okay, but quiz. All right. So chapter 13 is that manifest destiny chapter. So westward expansion, that kind of thing. So remember that during this time period, people in the United States were super excited about westward expansion, thinking, oh, this is going to be great. We're going to cover the continent from sea to shining sea. And this was the manifest destiny of the United States. So it's an opportunity that God had put forward for the United States, people in the United States. And it would also be a bonus for the people who were living in the territories already. So we could take over, we could make them better. And if you're wondering, like, why do we think we would make them better? Because we were us. And it was really clear that we were going to make things better, because if we weren't supposed to make things better, then God wouldn't have made us strong enough to take people over so easily. It's a fairly simple way of looking at things, and fairly beneficial to you if you're the one that's easily taking people over. So there you go. And I know usually people ascribe that to racism. And I think racism's a part of it. It's not all of it, but I think it's part of it. I do. Yeah. And because of the time we're in, and I mean, it's legitimate. You should always judge, I think, as much as you can, history by the time they were in. But it's also hard not to look through your own lens and current events and that sort of thing. Um, I always try to remind students that for whatever reason, this is my own kind of cynical view of things, human nature is not always good. So there's something about us individually, us as groups of people, whatever group we're in, that when we do something we probably know we shouldn't do, we're going to find a way to justify it. And, part of the way we can justify it is we're better than whoever it is that we just did something bad to. So therefore it was acceptable for us to treat them poorly. And so then you just have to find your reason why you're better. And, clearly you couldn't have gotten away with it if you weren't smarter, you weren't stronger. And then you have to figure out, why are you smarter and stronger? And you were just born that way. And if you were just born smarter and stronger, then it has to have something to do with some immutable characteristic that you have, something that you can't really change. So um, your natural intelligence, your skin color, your ethnicity, your nationality, your parents, something like that. And the reason that I say that is, you've studied enough world history to know that most world power type countries throughout history, when they've been at the height of their power, they're fairly nationalist, racist, ethnocentric, that sort of thing. They think they're better than everybody else. They do, for whatever reason. So when you've got a country taking over other countries, they kind of naturally think they're better. And they are probably better militarily. And then you can ascribe other characteristics to that, like we're better intellectually and we're better spiritually and all that sort of stuff. Plus, when we take over other people, it makes them better, because then they get to be part of us. So, yeah, I don't know. But anyway, we're kind of in that mood regionally during this time period. We know we're not taking over the world in the 1850s. We know that in the 1840s. But we do know that the neighbors are in trouble. We're also taking over neighbors that are fairly sparsely populated, whether they're Mexico or Native Americans. And I know that parts of Mexico not sparsely populated. Mexico City was pretty big during this time period, and Veracruz and a couple of other larger places. But the parts of Mexico that are now the United States, not too many people lived there. So it was fairly easy to take those places over. Yeah, there you go. All right. So Texas. So I know you had Texas history, and I don't want to spoil any of your Texas history memories, but when Texas became part of, or when Texas gained its independence, let's go back, when people decided to go settle in Texas when it was part of Mexico, there were a couple of rules. No slavery, because the Mexican Empire didn't have slavery. They'd gotten rid of that some time before. No slaves, and you needed to be Catholic. Now, because Texas was so far away from Mexico City, it's not like they were going to send troops up very often to enforce any of this stuff. But it was kind of your general agreement. So when people came to Texas, a lot of times they brought slaves, and they knew they weren't supposed to, but their thought was, it's far away. What are they going to do? And when the Mexican government reminded leaders in Texas, hey, slavery, it's not a thing, that was a source of frustration to some of those Texas leaders who then went to Mexico City and said, look, you don't tell us what to do. And then they threw them in jail. So, and then they got out and they came back, and then you started to have the movement for independence, which, as we all know, go Texas, we love, God bless Texas, was successful. And then there's part of the reason that the Mexican War starts is the lower Texas boundary. The disputed boundary, was it the Nueces River or was it the Rio Grande? So the US will send troops between those two potential borders, and that will irritate Mexico enough that they'll fire on the US troops, and then we'll declare war, and then it's on. Now, if you're wondering why we wanted war with Mexico, well, not everybody did. And it's probably important for you to realize, as far as reasons for Texas independence, so we can remember the Alamo. No, because they didn't like the stipulations of the Mexican government. They were far enough away from the seat of government, Mexico City, that they felt like they could do whatever they wanted. And maybe, a little bit of egging on the fight. But the stipulations they really didn't like were that you were required to be Catholic. There's a state religion, which, pretty loosely enforced, and that you couldn't have slaves, which was at least more strongly suggested, but because of distance, probably wasn't terribly well enforced either. Okay, so and also people just wanted to be independent. There's always that, they wanted to set their own rules and not pay taxes and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it's not like Texas was super strictly governed, but once they did start pushing back, Santa Anna came, and not by himself, it led the Mexican army. And so, I mean, there were troops that were sent. I'm not saying no one was ever in Texas. I am saying that when the leaders of Texas started to push back against the rules, the stipulations, the laws, they were laws from Mexico, then Mexico sent troops and it was on. And that little thing about the border. Okay. So, different states had different feelings about joining the Mexican War. That general manifest destiny, we want to expand the country, that sort of thing, was the big reason that there was a lot of popular support for the Mexican War. But within Congress, you saw some north-south stuff going on a little bit. The northern folks who opposed the Mexican War, Abraham Lincoln included, most of the transcendentalist writers, those guys, the ones your English teachers like, Thoreau and Emerson and Poe, who really doesn't fit, the genre, but he's kind of in there. And the guy that wrote about Puritans, Hawthorne, what was it, Scarlet Letter, that guy. I think he's in that same generation. Walt Whitman's kind of in there. He sort of fits it, sort of doesn't. Although he writes an interesting poem about Abraham Lincoln when Abraham Lincoln is assassinated. But anyway, you had people, transcendentalists, famous Northern politicians, most famous, of course, Abraham Lincoln. I think Stephen Douglas opposed it too, but opposing the Mexican War and voting against it when they've, said, do we go to war? Because you have to actually vote if you're going to war. And the reason they voted against it was slavery. They saw this as a potential way to add more Southern territory because, Mexican territory was mostly in the South, probably exception of Utah. You're wondering, did the Mormons who went to Utah, did they also oppose having to be Catholic? I'm going to go with yes. Did they have slaves? Not as often. That was more unusual. There aren't very many instances of that. Okay. Anyway, although if you could afford to go to Utah, you had money and okay. But anyway, so northern states tended to oppose the Mexican War, southern states tended to favor it. Once the that's clearly not the whole story, but it's a lot of the story. Once Oh, sorry for the yawn. Once the decision was made to go to war, then of course, you have to kind of go along with it and vote for the appropriations, the money that it takes to pay for going to war. So mm, the war proceeds, goes pretty well, and then toward the end of the war, when it becomes clear we're going to win and gain some territory, and when we went into the war, we knew that we wanted to get control of that part of Texas and California, maybe some of the trade routes in New Mexico. You didn't really care about Arizona, no offense if you really like Arizona, or Colorado or Utah, that part, a little farther north, it was more sparsely populated. But later on, we'll be glad we had it because they're going to discover silver in Colorado, and Mormons will really like Utah. That is where they went. All right. So as it's clear we're going to win the war, this David Wilmot fellow, who's more of a free soil guy, remember he said he doesn't want to be, what was the word he used, sentimental or something like this. He doesn't think blacks and whites should be equal. It's not why he opposes slavery. He opposes slavery because he doesn't want black guys to have economic opportunity in the West. He's pretty sure that God wants white guys to have economic opportunity in the West. What a fun time period. So he issues the Wilmot Proviso, which says any new land that was gained in the Mexican War should not be open to slavery, and more for a free soil reason than I think people are equal kind of reason. However, it's important for you to realize the Wilmot Proviso doesn't pass, but it leads to just a ton of debate. Yeah, so an argument, and it really it's the beginning of that series of things that leads up to the Civil War. The list mostly here, but you can start with Mexican War, Wilmot Proviso. Okay. You definitely want to have some awareness of the political parties changing during this time period. How, we had gone from, when we first started talking about political parties in the United States, you had Federalists and you had these Democratic Republicans who are referred to in your book as Republicans, but then they turn into National Republicans during John Quincy Adams, Monroe a little bit too, during Monroe and Adams, and then they turn into just Democrats once you get Andrew Jackson. Sorry, my throat is burning. So once you get Andrew Jackson, then they're really like Jacksonian Democrats, maybe. So, and then just Democrats. And then because there's really just that one party, no matter whatever we called them, the opposition party that develops is the Whigs. So you end up with the Whigs. And really the thing the Whigs stand for is hating Andrew Jackson. You have the Whig party that hates Andrew Jackson, but then they start to take a stance on slavery. So you have some anti-slavery Whigs and some pro-slavery Whigs. They call them conscience Whigs, or the anti-slavery ones. And then another anti-slavery party develops, the Free Soil Party. And that's that really peculiar party. You had a weekly question about them. That doesn't want to see the spread of slavery because they don't want black guys to have economic opportunity in the West. Now, within the Free Soil Party are some old folks from the Liberty Party who really did just want to end slavery. But the founding reasons for, the Free Soil Party really are to preserve economic opportunity for whites in the West. Sorry. So the Free Soil Party is a little peculiar. And as you know, Free Soil Party, Know Nothing Party, American Party, not really prominent parties. But they take away votes from Democrats and Whigs. And the Whig Party starts to collapse. It had been the opposition party, but it starts to collapse because of slavery. And then some people kind of migrate to Free Soil or Liberty Party. The Know Nothing Party was the We Hate Immigrants Party. That's primarily what they did. And they won some local elections, some state elections, especially in cities where, or states with cities where lots of immigrants came. And you remember there's lots of immigration in the 1840s and 50s, primarily from, Ireland and Germany, like 3 million from Ireland, 1 million from Germany. And this Know Nothing American Party, kind of prominent during that big Irish immigration phase, but then you start to see them fade away in the 1850s. Free Soil and the Conscience Whigs kind of come together, and then they reform, not reform, but reform the Republican Party. And then that's when you start to see Abraham Lincoln emerging as a leader of the Republican Party. And the Republican Party, in its modern-ish form, is the party that opposes slavery. So it's the party of Lincoln. All right, I'm looking at the chat now. No, you guys are fine on the computer stuff. Mine was kind of cutting out at the beginning of class too. So I don't know why that happens, but probably because we're all on it, right? Okay. So changes in political parties. I think this can be a confusing thing because we're really used to, in the modern era, just having Democrats and Republicans, but all these other parties kind of, yeah. So the Whigs were the opposition party to the Democrats, initially formed because they just hated Andrew Jackson. And then they started to split on slavery. Free Soil is an anti-slavery party that was racist. They didn't want African Americans to have opportunities to advance economically. So they knew we were getting new land in the West. So they wanted to make sure all that new land was reserved for white people. You also had the Liberty Party, which I didn't mention, which really did want slaves to be freed. Know Nothing Party is an anti-immigrant party. Kind of fades away after immigration becomes less of an issue. I didn't really mention this, but I will now. One of the things that you notice in American history, US history, because we're a nation of immigrants, and not most nations aren't nations of immigrants. They really aren't. So, we're a little different. And one of the things about us that may not be most pleasantly different is when we get a big wave of immigrants, we usually hate them. We give them a hard time. Their culture's different. People speak some language that isn't English. What the heck? We always like their food. We're okay with everybody's food, it seems. But every other part of their culture, if their religion is different, their language, whatever, we don't like them. And one of the things we don't like about immigrants is they bring wages down. Okay. We tend to dislike the group of immigrants until we have a war, and then we draft a whole bunch of them. So what you'll notice with Irish immigrants is they were pretty poorly treated until the Civil War, where we draft a very disproportionate number of Irish immigrants because we tended to draft disproportionately from the cities in the north because, those were population centers. And there were lots of Irish immigrants in the city. So after the war, it's like, they fought a war. They're one of us. They're patriotic too. And then after that, it's like, we don't dislike them anymore. You'll notice a similar thing with Italian immigrants in World War I, and then with Mexican immigrants in World War II. Yeah. So anyway, all right. Just thought I would mention that. And events that lead up to the Civil War, clearly the Mexican War, adding all the land, Compromise of 1850, which I didn't even mention in here. What was I thinking? So Compromise of 1850, which leads to popular sovereignty, where the new territory gets to vote, will we be slave or free, which leads to Bleeding Kansas, which is the Civil War between the two factions, pro and anti-slavery factions in Kansas. And this isn't just arguments in Congress, this is people killing each other, including John Brown, moving down to Kansas to help some of his older kids who were part of the struggle. And John Brown leading the Osawatomie massacre. You're going like, yeah, we've never heard of either. Potawatomi massacre was where the pro-slavery folks killed the anti-slavery folks. And the Osawatomie massacre was, these are around a couple of creeks that are named for Native American groups in the area. So, but the Osawatomie massacre was the return. And if you pay attention, like really close attention in your 1302 class, I think it was Teddy Roosevelt that announced his campaign for president, the first one. I think it was the first one at Osawatomie Creek where John Brown had gone and killed people. So, moderately weird. Anyway, Teddy Roosevelt was a little weird, wasn't he? So Bleeding Kansas is that civil war, which eventually ends up in Kansas being a free state, much to the distress of their neighbor, Missouri. Sumner Brooks affair, that happens while Bleeding Kansas is happening. This is the congressman that beats up the senator with a cane because they're arguing over slavery. And the Sumner fellow, Charles Sumner, mentions Preston Brooks as an evil slave owner. And then Preston Brooks' nephew goes into the Senate and beats Sumner over the head with a cane. And it's a sign of physical violence breaking out in the legislature, which is probably, I don't know if foreshadowing is the right word for history, but it's certainly an indication of the difficulty on the issue of slavery. Dred Scott decision, that's the court case where Dred Scott, former slave, says that he does not believe he should continue to be a slave because he lived in free territory. And the Supreme Court says you can't even bring a case to the Supreme Court because you're Black, therefore you're not a citizen. And the distinction wasn't because you were a slave, but because you were Black. And that also officially meant that free Blacks didn't have any rights, according to the Supreme Court, and also suggested that no state really had the right to limit slavery in any way. So this creates a little turmoil. And then John Brown will create his own turmoil because he thinks God has picked him to be the end of slavery in the United States, or lead a movement to end slavery in the United States. So he decides to raid Harper's Ferry, Virginia, where there's a federal arsenal, and take all the weapons and then arm a slave rebellion that's a lot like Nat Turner's rebellion, where you go from plantation to plantation and free the slaves. They really don't get past the arsenal where they get caught. And some of them die in the fight to take over the arsenal. Others get executed later. So, and then John Brown gives a speech right before he's executed, and he also sends copies of it out to the press, where he talks about how if his blood and the blood of his sons at the Bleeding Kansas thing, Osawatomie and Potawatomi, not in that order, if the blood of his sons and millions of slaves who had come before them had to be shed to end slavery, and if his blood, John Brown's, had to join that pool of blood, so be it. So as long as slavery ended, he didn't mind giving up his life. Now, the controversy regarding John Brown, there were lots of abolitionists that came out of this Puritan, well, sort of Puritan, but also the Quaker tradition, where he thought slavery was wrong, that sort of thing. But the Quaker tradition is decidedly nonviolent. They're pacifists. They're definitely not going to join a war effort. So John Brown kind of pushes the envelope, as it were, to a system where you are not only willing to fight for your cause and willing to give up your life, you were willing to take someone else's life in addition. So John Brown's activities really push the abolition movement to the point where they are either willing to accept violence, a war, as the way that has to end slavery, or they're at least starting to see that as an acceptable way to try to end slavery. So it even pushes people like Emerson and Thoreau, who had certainly protested and famously not paid taxes, that kind of thing, and were willing to do nonviolent sorts of things to help bring an end to slavery, but maybe weren't as interested in doing officially violent sorts of things. So John Brown kind of legitimizes the use of violence to end slavery, and then certainly leads to every major figure in the United States, every major politician, famous person having to talk about, was John Brown right? Was it really okay to use violence to end slavery? All right. I think your list of other stuff is a little more precise, I suppose. I don't know. But for chapter 14, and I know these are things you've already thought about some, Northern and Southern advantages and disadvantages in the Civil War. With the North, it's pretty much everything: more people, established government, established foreign relations, established military, larger economy. So more people, more money, established relationships, established government. But they're having to fight an offensive war, so they're going to have to invade the South to accomplish their purpose. The South had home field advantage. They knew what they were defending. They probably probably had better military leadership. Almost everybody thought so, at least at the beginning of the war. And they probably had the strength of the cause, which was whatever, preserve the Southern way of life. I know that people didn't officially go to slavery go to the Civil War to preserve slavery, even though slavery is written into the Constitution. Slavery is clearly the big states' rights issue that leads to the Civil War. But I also know that, the average person who joined the war or was drafted isn't going to say, I'm going to defend slavery. They're going to say they're going to defend the Southern way of life and their own homeland and their actual home. And the Southern way of life certainly included slavery, there's no doubt. But anyway, Southern advantages then were strength of the cause, home field advantage. They knew the territory they were defending, and that certainly was helpful. And then military leadership, most especially Stonewall Jackson, sorry for yawn, and Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee. That's Robert E. Lee. Okay. All right. Key battles in the Civil War. If I listed them, you may want to just make Bull Run's early. Antietam is huge as far as numbers of people participating. Gettysburg also big, but one of the first, at least marginal Northern victories, because you probably remember the South wins pretty much everything the first couple of years. So the Battle of Gettysburg is a marginal Northern victory. It also has so many casualties. I mean, it's really big. And this is in 1863, and Vicksburg is shortly after. And Vicksburg is where Grant's Army of the Potomac, I think. No, is that Grant's Army? I can't remember. Grant's Army captures the southern part of the Mississippi River, which helps cut off supply lines to the South and is going to lead to enormous problems. That's Vicksburg. Sherman's March to the Sea is that employment of total war toward the end of the war, which is really supposed to completely demoralize people in the South, and it's fairly successful. And it's slash and burn kind of stuff. He destroys property, homes, families, that, he kills civilians, that sort of stuff. And the goal is to get everyone just to abandon the route so that they're not there to defend it, and to demoralize people so that they will desert, which you started to see. And Appomattox Courthouse is the site of the surrender, So why it's often mentioned. So I would definitely, just kind of review those battles. And your book does a nice job of going through those relatively quickly. 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, you got to know what they are for a variety of reasons, weekly questions, and I think they show up at least in one multiple choice. So 13th ends slavery. 14th is equal protection under the law and I just said that, equal protection under the law and citizenship. So it's a reversal of the Dred Scott case. That's weird when you just say something and can't remember it. Like you guys, I'm really tired too. And 15th Amendment, that allows former slaves the right to vote. Sorry, my shoulder's super sore too. Lincoln's Reconstruction Plan versus Wade Davis. So Lincoln says, 10% of the former Confederates say that they'll be loyal to the Union. We'll let them vote and have elections. And the Congress is not okay with that. That's not nearly enough people voting, or excuse me, not nearly enough people repudiating the Confederacy. So their plan, the Wade Davis plan, is that 50% of eligible voters have to say they never voluntarily supported the Confederacy, which is going to be impossible for a little while, until more people who couldn't vote and who were younger come up and go like, yeah, I was a kid, I couldn't have voluntarily supported the Confederacy. So the Wade Davis bill is much more punitive. Now Congress passes the Wade Davis bill, Lincoln suggests his and they go like, nope. And so Congress passes Wade Davis and Lincoln is going to refuse to sign it, which has the effect of it not becoming law because it happens toward the end of the legislative session. I know we've talked about this before, so it's officially called a pocket veto. All right, and goals and sentiments of Lincoln's second inaugural. And I know there's a link to that in your notes. You can also look it up. Lincoln gives really short speeches, so I never feel bad about saying you should read the speech. But the second inaugural is kind of unique because it says that the Civil War is really the fault of both the North and the South. The South because it wanted to preserve and continue to use the system of slavery, and the North because they allowed it to happen. And he said God punished both the North and the South for continuing to allow the sin of slavery in the United States. He quotes a bunch of scripture in there as well. And then he kind of closes it up with saying we need to take care of the widows and orphans from both the North and the South. And we need to work together to, build a better country. It's what does he say in the speech? Let us bind the wounds of the nation together. But it's really profound kind of stuff. And Lincoln's really good at the short speech. Really good. I think he's the best presidential speech writer, giver, speaker that we've had because he understands that shorter is better. Yeah, in the modern era, that doesn't happen. All right. And the most recent chapter, land redistribution, which we've talked about a bunch of times. Purpose of the Freedmen's Bureau. Ideally, they were going to distribute the 40 acres and a mule to each slave family, but also teach former slaves to read, some health care, reuniting slave families that were separated either because of the war or because somebody had been sold away before the war, or during. The biggest successes of the Freedmen's Bureau, I know your book talks about this a lot, really, teaching the former slaves to read, basic literacy, reuniting families, and some basic medical care. So it doesn't do everything it's supposed to do, but it does something. Johnson's attitude toward land redistribution, he reversed it. So he's clearly not okay with it. He does not think that slaves should get land. And because the South is an agricultural society, without land, you have no wealth. and it's going to be a problem for you. All right, I feel like we just talked about important successes and failures of the Freedmen's Bureau, but here we have a federal agency developed specifically to help former slaves. So it's pretty unique. I would say the biggest failure is the biggest failure of Reconstruction altogether, that no land was redistributed, because unless there's an opportunity to have wealth, and I don't mean to be wealthy, but I mean to be able to support yourself and pay your own bills, then you're never going to be independent. So we set former slaves up for failure by not giving them, and giving them it sounds, I don't know, not quite like what it is, but allowing them to have some land of the former plantation owner. And if you're thinking, well, that doesn't seem fair, well, slavery, does that seem fair to you? And the issue with slaves and their economic situation should be obvious. They worked their whole lives and never got paid. And their parents worked their whole lives and never got paid. And their grandparents worked their whole lives and never got paid. So if no one ever gets paid because they're owned, you can't develop family wealth. And family wealth is really kind of what, and again, I'm not talking about being wealthy, but owning your own, having your own place to live. These guys didn't even have a place to live or technically own their own clothing because no money. So that really is the problem of Reconstruction, and it's the problem of the Freedmen's Bureau as well. Okay. So laws regarding Reconstruction, including the Civil War amendments, so that's 13, 14, and 15. And you may want to make a note, at least a mental note, of the difference between Lincoln's Reconstruction Plan, the Wade Davis bill, Johnson's Reconstruction Plan, which is like, whatever you want to do, and then Congressional Reconstruction or military Reconstruction, where they developed the 5 military districts. So it's what I would think about with the laws regarding Reconstruction and the Civil War amendments. Successes and failures of Reconstruction, that's your weekly question. So I know you're thinking about that, and we've talked about that 8 million times, or 5 or 6. So I feel like we're good there. You should probably know that Johnson got impeached but not convicted, and why he got impeached. And it was the use of the Tenure of Office Act, which the Congress created specifically so they would have a way to impeach the president, because to impeach the dude, he's got to do something illegal. And Johnson was annoying. He vetoed a whole bunch of legislation. They overrode the veto that annoyed him as well. Vetoes, I should say. And he would occasionally come in and just cuss out Congress. So he was a very annoying fellow. He didn't tend to break laws. So they knew he was going to fire Edwin Stanton, Lincoln's former Secretary of State. So they made a law that essentially said you can't fire Edwin Stanton unless we give you permission. So, and he did, and then they impeached. The KKK and the Enforcement Act, you'll want to know that the KKK is a domestic terrorist group, and their major goal is to harass African Americans to the point that they were too scared to vote. And that harassment, of course, included violence. When the Enforcement Act was passed, they have 2 of them, 72 and 73. This allowed Southern military governors, the 5 district governors, to request troops and have them sent to the South to protect African Americans on Election Day, but also to have them stationed nearby to suppress the activities of the KKK. And that was successful. So as an organization, you saw their effectiveness really decreased dramatically in that era, 72, 73. Now you still saw local anti-African American laws, black codes, restrictions on voting, that sort of stuff. And the Supreme Court upheld those. So the KKK, this, the violent terrorist group that really harassed African Americans, they were very active up until 72, 73, and then are really pushed underground because of the Enforcement Acts or Force Acts. And they'll reemerge from time to time, as we've talked about, in more public ways. Reconstruction difficulties in the Grant administration, just remember, especially in the second term, because of all the scandals and the emphasis on building railroads and money that people could gain from those railroad contracts, you start to see the Grant-directed second term government really move away from the enforcement of Reconstruction. And then the election of 1876, the Hayes-Tilden election, you end up with the compromise of 1877 because of disputed election results. And that compromise or bargain of 1877 is the official end of military Reconstruction. The troops are removed from the South. You go from the 5 military districts to the 11 original Confederate states. And then they get to vote for whoever they want to and kind of run their state the way that they like, in exchange for a promise of recognizing the civil rights of African Americans in the South, which doesn't really happen. And also part of the bargain is the railroad from Texas to California. One Southerner in the cabinet, something else. End of military Reconstruction is the big one. Yeah. Oh, the South has to promise to uphold civil rights in the South. And they promise, but they don't really do it. Okay. There you go. So that is the official review for the day. Now, before we go away, and I wish you good luck and thank you for taking my class and hope that you learned something. And sorry if I was annoying to you. It was not my goal. But hopefully you learned something about history. That's always the goal. History. It's what matters, right? So before I go away and take, double check on the roll, do you guys have any questions you want to ask about anything? I know some of you checked in a little late. Sorry about the whole, sorry, my throat. I know some of you checked in a little late. So just a gentle reminder about grades. I think that I'm done grading everything, that I'm current on everything except book reviews, which I will catch up on tonight and tomorrow. So book review, sorry, but book review. Okay. If you have anything that you've turned in and the grade does not show, let me know, except for book reviews. And then I'll send an email when I think I'm done with book reviews that says, hey, I'm done with book reviews. Check your grade. If it doesn't appear, let me know. And by appear, a couple of you've already noticed this. There are certain times, like if you submit something and then you resubmit, for some reason it doesn't override the first grade sometimes. So if the first grade was 0 or lower, that's going to be a problem for you. So please, please, please check your grade and make sure that it's an accurate reflection of what it should be, okay? All right. I think that I'm done talking about stuff. So hang on a sec after I end the recording and then we'll double check the roll. Shouldn't be hard today. No. All right.